Some factions are remembered because they dominated. Others are remembered because they changed history. Evolution did both. It created two of the biggest superstars WWE has ever seen. But in doing so, it also planted the seeds of its own destruction. This is the story of how Triple H built the perfect faction, only to watch it fall apart from the inside. For more cinematic stories from wrestling history, subscribe to Wrestle District. Now, let's go back to where Evolution began. By 2003, WWE had entered a new era. The stars who defined the Attitude Era were beginning to disappear, and the company needed new names to lead what came next. Triple H was already at the center of Monday Night Raw. He was the World Heavyweight Champion. He had power. He had influence. And with Ric Flair standing beside him, he also had legitimacy. But Triple H wanted more than another championship reign. He wanted to build something that could shape WWE for years. A faction connecting wrestling's past, present, and future. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, it was a time bomb. Every generation needs someone to lead it. But Triple H wasn't looking for followers. He was looking for a legacy. The foundation had been created months earlier. At Unforgiven in 2002, Ric Flair turned on Rob Van Dam and helped Triple H retain the World Heavyweight Championship. Flair was no longer simply a legend from another era. He became Triple H's mentor, advisor, and closest ally. Together, they began searching for the men who could represent what came next. Randy Orton immediately stood out. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he belonged in the spotlight long before he had earned it. He was young, naturally gifted, and already connected to wrestling history as a third-generation performer. But his family name was not the only reason Triple H noticed him. Orton could move, react, and sell like someone with the instincts to become a major star. Batista was completely different. He was older, less experienced, far quieter. But he possessed the kind of presence that could change the atmosphere of a room without saying a word. Orton was the natural. Batista was the weapon. On February 3rd, 2003, Triple H officially gave the group its identity. Ric Flair represented the past. Triple H represented the present. Randy Orton and Batista represented the future. Together, they were Evolution. But before the faction could take control of WWE, it nearly disappeared. Both Orton and Batista were sidelined by injuries. Batista tore his triceps, tried to return too soon, and injured it again. For a group built around creating the next generation, that generation suddenly looked uncertain. WWE even filmed promotional footage with Mark Jindrak as a potential replacement. But Triple H and Flair remained convinced that Batista was the right man. So they waited. Orton returned first. Batista followed months later, attacking Goldberg and collecting a bounty placed by Triple H. At last, all four pieces were in place, and once Evolution was complete, Monday Night Raw belonged to them. Evolution never presented itself like an ordinary wrestling faction. They wore tailored suits, arrived in limousines, celebrated wealth, championships, and excess. They did not look like four men attempting to reach the top. They looked like four men who already owned it. Triple H was the centerpiece. Ric Flair was the credibility. Batista was the muscle. And Randy Orton was the prodigy developing in front of the world. Their greatest night came at Armageddon in December 2003. Orton defeated Rob Van Dam to win the Intercontinental Championship. Flair and Batista captured the World Tag Team Championship, and Triple H regained the World Heavyweight Championship. By the end of the event, every member of Evolution was holding gold. 4 men, 4 championships, one faction controlling Monday Night Raw. But the titles only explained part of their success. Evolution worked because every member received something he needed. Triple H surrounded himself with protection. Flair returned to the center of WWE television and began to feel like the nature boy again. Batista learned how a main event star should look, move, and carry himself. And Orton received the platform to become more than a promising young wrestler. He became the legend killer. He targeted the heroes of previous generations and treated their reputations as stepping stones. At WrestleMania 20, Evolution defeated The Rock and Mick Foley. Orton scored the winning fall over Foley. 1 month later, the two met again in a brutal Falls Count Anywhere match at Backlash. It was violent, uncomfortable, and designed to answer whether Orton was truly ready to stand on his own. By the end of the match, the answer was clear. He was no longer simply Evolution's youngest member. He was becoming one of WWE's most important rising stars. And that created a problem no one inside the faction wanted to acknowledge. Evolution had been built to create the next generation. But what would happen when that generation no longer needed Triple H? At SummerSlam 2004, Randy Orton defeated Chris Benoit and became the youngest world heavyweight champion in WWE history. The plan had worked. Evolution had created a world champion. It should have been their greatest success. Instead, it became the moment everything began to collapse. The next night on Raw, Evolution celebrated Randy Orton's victory. Confetti fell from the ceiling. Ric Flair applauded. Batista lifted Orton onto his shoulders. For a moment, it appeared that the faction was united behind its new champion. Then, Triple H gave the signal. Batista dropped Orton to the mat. The celebration became an assault, and Evolution expelled the man who had fulfilled its original promise. Triple H claimed Orton had forgotten who made him. But the truth was simpler. Orton had become a threat. As long as he held the Intercontinental Championship, Triple H could proudly describe him as the future. But once Orton held the same World Championship, Triple H believed belonged to him. That future had arrived too soon. The betrayal exposed the contradiction at the heart of Evolution. Triple H wanted to build the next generation. He simply wanted it to remain beneath him. He could mentor Orton, guide him, protect him, even celebrate his success, but he could not accept him as an equal. 1 month later, Triple H defeated Orton and reclaimed the World Heavyweight Championship. The mentor had restored the old hierarchy. The first rebellion was over. For a moment, it seemed Triple H had saved Evolution. But removing Orton did not solve the problem. It only transferred it, because another future world champion was still standing beside him. Batista had watched everything. He had seen how quickly loyalty disappeared when Triple H felt threatened. He had seen what happened when a student became too successful. And unlike Orton, Batista did not rush. He waited, he listened, and he learned. Triple H had eliminated one threat. He had no idea an even bigger one was quietly waiting beside him. Batista's rise was different from Orton's. Orton demanded attention. Batista earned it slowly. He remained in the background, protected Triple H, followed orders, and spoke only when necessary. But the audience began to notice him. Every display of strength received a louder reaction. Every moment of hesitation around Triple H created more tension. Batista was still loyal, but he was no longer invisible. At New Year's Revolution in 2005, Triple H, Batista, and Randy Orton entered the Elimination Chamber for the vacant World Heavyweight Championship. Batista helped Triple H survive and eventually win. He was still the loyal enforcer. But the match demonstrated something Triple H could no longer ignore. Batista was capable of becoming champion himself. Then came the Royal Rumble. Triple H tried to discourage Batista from entering. The reason was obvious. If Batista won, he would receive a World Championship match at WrestleMania, and he could choose Triple H. Batista entered anyway. He survived. And after last eliminating John Cena, he won the 2005 Royal Rumble. For the first time, the decision belonged entirely to him. Triple H and Ric Flair immediately began directing Batista towards SmackDown. They told him the WWE Championship was the smarter target. They claimed Evolution could control both brands, but behind every piece of advice was fear. Triple H did not want Batista standing across the ring from him, so he attempted to manipulate him. Triple H and Flair secretly arranged for Batista to believe that people on SmackDown were trying to provoke him. They hoped fear and anger would push him away from Raw, but Batista overheard them discussing the plan. He finally understood that their advice had never been about his future. It had always been about protecting Triple H's championship. Batista did not confront them immediately. He allowed them to believe the manipulation had worked. Then, on February 21st, 2005, he entered the ring for the contract signing. Triple H and Flair stood beside him, convinced that Batista would choose SmackDown. Batista looked at them, raised his hand, and gave them a thumbs up. Then, slowly, he turned it down. In one gesture, Batista rejected Triple H's control. He chose the World Heavyweight Championship. He chose WrestleMania. And he chose Triple H. Batista drove his former leader through a table and ended the illusion that Evolution could survive. At WrestleMania 21, the future finally stood across the ring from the present. Triple H entered as the established champion. Batista entered as the star Evolution had helped create. And this time, Triple H could not stop what he had started. Batista defeated him and became World Heavyweight Champion. He defeated him again at Backlash. Then, inside Hell in a Cell at Vengeance, Batista defeated Triple H for a third time. It was no accident. It was no temporary rebellion. Batista had surpassed him. The faction that once ruled WWE had finally collapsed. Not because an enemy destroyed it, but because its own future refused to stay in the shadows. Evolution's original run did not last long. Its impact lasted for decades. The faction succeeded because it did more than collect championships. It changed 4 careers at the same time. Randy Orton became one of the most accomplished and enduring performers in WWE history. Batista became a multiple-time world champion and eventually built a successful career far beyond wrestling. Ric Flair regained confidence, relevance, and a central role on WWE television. And Triple H became the architect of a group whose influence continued long after it collapsed. That is what made Evolution different. It used wrestling's past to build what came next, but its greatest strength was also its fatal weakness. The group depended on Orton and Batista becoming stars. Once they did, the hierarchy could no longer survive. Years later, Evolution returned to face the Shield. But by 2014, the meaning had changed. Evolution no longer represented the next generation. They were the established veterans attempting to stop it. This time, the Shield stood in the position Evolution once occupied. Young, hungry, united, and determined to take control of WWE. At Payback, the Shield eliminated every member of Evolution without losing a single member of their own team. The cycle was complete. Evolution had once been created to replace the old generation. Now, they had become the old generation. That is the true legacy of Evolution. Not simply that they dominated, not simply that they won championships, but that they created the stars who would eventually destroy them. Triple H built the perfect faction. Ric Flair gave it history. Randy Orton gave it its first glimpse of the future. Batista brought that future crashing through the door. Some factions win championships. Evolution changed history. What do you think? Is Evolution the greatest faction in WWE history, or does another group deserve that title? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. This is Wrestle District.